multilingualism per se? Yeah, great questions. I'm sorry I don't have a more coherent answer about how it functions.
Apologies to Gary, but that's all the time we have before we switch to our second speaker. So now I'd like to introduce Marina Bedny, who directs the Neuroplasticity and Development Lab at Johns Hopkins University.
Hey there, thank you. Let's see if I can wrangle my computer. Okay, did that work?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So let me see. I can only see parts of my slides when I do this. So let me just see one sec. Okay. Let's try this again one more time. Okay. So first of all, I want to say a big thank you, of course, to the organizers. This has been such a pleasure, this meeting, and I just want to say particularly thank you for curating just this creative combination of talks from very different perspectives that are just so rich. Asifa's talk was completely inspiring and amazing, and I hope there will be some connections coming up as we talk. So what I want to talk to you about today is insights into how language transforms the mind and brain from studies with blind individuals, or mostly that's what I'll talk about. Before I get to talking, of course, I want to say that this work that I'm talking about is not my work, it's our work. These are just some of the postdocs and graduate students and collaborators that have worked in my lab and in other labs as well. Judy St. Kim and Lisa Muz both have presentations at this conference on topics that I'll talk about, and I'll highlight their work when I get there. I also want to highlight my blind friend Lindsay, who is someone who gives me lots of ideas. So some of the stuff in this talk has come from her head. Okay, so the question that I'm interested in is the one that many of the people at this conference are also interested in, which is how do nature and nurture, and in particular the nurture side, how does experience causally shape our mind and brain and give rise to the cognitive resources and mental representations that we have? And also, how is it that we are these incredibly sophisticated, smart creatures, and also we vary a lot, right? So unlike other animals, we live in lots of different environments. Some of us get, our food from the supermarket. Some of us hunt for our food. Some of us spend 8 hours a day programming computers. Others spend our days doing other things. And so I think studying features of this variation can actually inform both this deep question of how our brain enables us and our mind to accommodate our varying niche, and also get to the nature-nurture questions of what are the causal variables that make our minds work the way that they do. So in our work, one population that we focused on is working with people who are blind from birth to understand the contribution of visual experience to the mind and brain. And I'm going to talk about two issues that I think working with blind individuals can inform. So one idea that I'm going to talk about is brain plasticity. I'm going to talk about this only briefly because I really want to get to the second part. So I apologize in advance if sometimes if things are described in too sketchy details, and we can get to it after the talk. But in particular, what I want to talk about is the ability of the human brain to adapt. And the reason that I've included that data in this talk is that I think it speaks to the important question of the degree to which experience can influence the way the brain works and the mind works. And in particular, in this domain, I will talk about what happens to the visual cortex, to the part of the brain that in sighted people does visual perception, things like edge detection, color perception, face recognition. What happens to that part of the brain in people who are blind as a window into the capacity of the human brain to change its representational content in what I will argue are qualitative ways. And then I'm going to spend most of the time talking about visual knowledge and blindness. So what kind of knowledge blind and sighted people share or don't share about the way vision works and the way light works and the way colors work, and the role of language in sharing that knowledge. Okay, and what I'm going to argue is that blind individuals and sighted people construct causal generative mental models of how vision and light and color work. And they do so in large part through inference, relying heavily on linguistic evidence. And we can talk about that and what I mean by that. So in many ways, I've shared some of the things that inspire many of the speakers and in this conference, and we're going at it in a different way. It'll be fun to see how these things connect. Okay, so before I get to the data, let's talk a little bit about the population of participants that we work with. The data I will tell you about come from people who are blind from birth with at most minimal light perception. These are individuals who are blind due to some problem with the eyes or optic nerve, so not due to brain damage. These are people who have no cognitive or neurological disabilities. In some of our earlier work, we did this through self-report. In the later work, people do standardized tests like the Woodcock-Johnson. This is a diverse pool of people. Blindness is a low incidence disability. So we take people between the ages for the adult studies of 18 and 78. And I've amended our IRB protocol several times to take older people because we found participants. The performance of these individuals is going to be compared to sighted age and education matched controls who are blindfolded during the course of the experiments. Actually, in this talk, I will not tell you about data from adult onset blindness, but if you want to know about critical period questions, we can talk about that another time. As I said, this is a diverse population of people. So, we have people who are students, people who are stay-at-home moms, people who are computer programmers, lots of different interesting people coming into the laboratory. And what they have in common is that they have grown up without visual perception. So they have never seen color, shape, or motion. They don't use their vision to get around or to do anything. Okay. If I've forgotten to say anything, maybe someone will remind me. All right, so I still don't see the top of my talk, but I will just soldier on. Okay. So first I want to talk to you about the plasticity data and to make this argument that the human brain has the capacity to qualitatively change its representational content. And this is of course not a foregone conclusion. And in fact, in this subfield, in the subfield of blindness, the majority of the field believes that even in people who are born blind, the visual cortex takes on vision-like functions so that its modality of response changes. So it might respond to auditory information or tactile information, but fundamentally the kind of processing it does, shape recognition, spatial information processing actually remains the same in blind and sighted people. And of course, all possibilities are theoretically on the table. It could have been the case that the visual cortex just atrophied if it didn't get its species typical visual input. So what I'm gonna tell you is that, of course, we've known for a while that the atrophy case doesn't happen. The visual cortex of people who are born blind responds to auditory and tactile information. What I'm gonna argue is that actually much of the visual cortex in blind people is involved in higher cognitive processes. And I'll give you two examples, namely language and math briefly. And the reason I think this is the case is because we're humans. Here's a mouse brain and a human brain. Most of the human brain is so-called association cortex, shown in white, doing things like language and symbolic reasoning. And so I think when you knock out bottom-up visual input, what happens to the visual cortex is that these higher cognitive processes that are already connect to it take over that system. Okay, so just to give you a flavor for this body of work. This is an experiment that was done by Connor Lane when he was in my lab in collaboration with Akira Maki. And so what Connor did is he presented blind and sighted participants with auditory sentences. So participants would hear a sentence and then a yes or no question. And the yes or no question asked people to query who did what to whom. And there were control stimuli were lists of non-words. So they sound like English, so they have the phonological properties of English, but they don't have any grammatical structure or meaning. And then there are two kinds of sentences, sentences with syntactic movements and sentences without syntactic movement. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that these types of sentences mean roughly the same thing. So there's really no semantic difference between the plus move and the minus move sentences. For our purposes, it's the case that the plus move sentences are grammatically more complex. And what Connor showed in this experiment is that if you compare sentences to non-words, in sighted people, you activate a left lateralized frontotemporal network as you do as people have shown in many experiments. In people who are blind, you additionally activate the visual cortex. And crucially, what I'm showing you on the right is that if you look in detail on responses in this visual in the visual cortex, what you see is higher responses to the grammatically complex than the grammatically simpler sentences. And of course, higher responses to both types of sentences than to not words. So what this suggests is that this part of the brain is acquiring responses to language. Shockingly, I find this shocking. This is not true in people who are sighted, even when they're blindfolded, and also it requires responses to grammatical complexity of sentences. Language is not the only cognitive operation that invades the visual system of people who are blind. So Shipra Kanjilia did her dissertation work on numerical processing in blind individuals, and there's lots of beautiful work that she did that I'm not going to get to tell you about. But here I'm showing you one experiment in which she compared people thinking about whether two math equations had the same value of X and whether two sentences had the same who did what to who meaning. And what you can see is that the sentences is actually replicating inside of people, a finding by Monti and colleagues. The sentences activate left lateralized frontotemporal networks, and the numerical task activates parietal cortices more inside of people. In blind people, what you see is the same thing, except that in addition to that, blind individuals are activating parts of the visual cortex, both on the ventral surface, on the lateral occipital cortex for language, and other parts of the visual cortex during the mathematical task. You can see that more clearly here, where I'm showing you a group by condition interaction, where blue areas are parts of the brain that blind individuals activate more for language than sighted people, and red regions are the ones that blind individuals activate more for math. And what's really cool, and what Shipra showed, is that the math responsive parts of the visual cortex respond to the complexity of math equations. So if you make the numbers bigger or you move the X to the wrong side, you get increases in activity in this part of the visual cortex in blind people. You also get that in parietal cortex. And a different part of the brain, as I told you before, responds to language and linguistic complexity. So even in the visual system, in a blind individuals, language and math don't share the same cortical resource, which I think is also super cool. One interesting thing that Connor showed in his data is that in blind individuals across different blind people, those blind individuals that show a bigger difference between complex and simpler sentences also do a bit better at answering the comprehension questions about the difficult sentences, suggesting that this part of the brain is probably not just kind of activating randomly for this process. It seems to relate to behavior. I'm now going to show you a little bit of data to suggest that actually there are some parts of language that blind individuals show advantages at behaviorally on average relative to sighted people. So many of you may have come in contact with this idea in popular culture, which is that if you lose one sense modality, then you compensate with other senses. You know, if you talk to blind people, they'll make jokes about this, right? Like, Superman powers, hearing things way far away. Of course, all of that is not true, but there are some selective enhancements in other modalities in blindness, including tactile enhancements related to Braille reading. But what I'm going to tell you is that we also get information from the world through language, and there is evidence that blind individuals also have language enhancements, not just enhancements in other sensory modalities. So this is work by Karen Arcos in collaboration with other people in the lab. And what Karen showed, so previous studies had shown that blind individuals have superior memory to sighted people. So if you just ask blind people to remember a list of letters or a list of words, in this case, it's letters. Blind individuals do better than sighted people, sometimes twice as many words are remembered. In this task, what Nora and Rita and Karen did is designed a recognition memory test so we could directly compare verbal and nonverbal material. So this is a recognition test with letters and a recognition test with non-verbalizable sounds, or as non-verbalizable as we could get them. And what you can see is that blind individuals, shown in gray, are better across loads for the verbal stimuli letters, but not really for the non-verbalizable sounds, or at least there's a larger benefit for the letters. Perhaps even more interestingly, in another study, Rita and Connor showed that blind individuals are better at answering comprehension questions about grammatically complex sentences. And this benefit was particularly enhanced for garden path sentences. And these are blind individuals who are matched to sighted people on reading ability, vocabulary, math performance. So it's not that these are, superhuman blind people. It's just that they're a bit better at understanding complex sentences. And I won't have time to kind of talk with you too much about what I think is going on. Except one thing I will say is that these two benefits that I've told you about, the one related to remembering lists of letters and the one related to understanding complex sentences, seem to be independent. So it's not the same blind people that are good at one or the other. So I think they're two independent language-related enhancements. But they might be of a kind, namely that blind individuals have some enhancements in verbal memory and sentence processing related working memory processes. So selective enhancements in linguistic behavior in people who are blind. Before I move on from these ideas, I just want to kind of put in a pretty random piece of data that might seem to make the point that there is a sense in which blindness is not a typical phenomena, right? So you could say like the experience of a blind person is atypical. But I would argue, echoing Asifa's talk, that we're all atypical in a variety of ways, right? And so programming for 8 hours a day is also pretty atypical from an evolutionary perspective. And moreover, what I would suggest is that, this property of the brain to reorganize, to accommodate varying ways of being in the world is just a fundamental property of human brains, not particular to blindness. And also gives me an opportunity to tell you about Yunfei Liu's research. So Yunfei is a Python aficionado. He's a programming guy. And what he's interested in is how human brains accommodate becoming a computer programmer. And what he showed in his experiment is that, interestingly, computer programming and language processing do not rely on similar neural systems. So you could have thought that because we have computer languages like Python, and we also call natural languages natural language, maybe they, there are various reasons to think maybe they share neural resources. So in the middle row, I'm showing you responses during Python processing. And the bottom row, I'm showing you responses during sentence processing. And the blue is the overlap between the two. And basically, you can see there isn't much overlap. By contrast, there is a lot of overlap between solving logical puzzles, like if X and Y, then not Z, if not X, Z, then X and Y, does that follow? That's what the participants were asked. And actually logical reasoning and Python overlap quite a bit, including in the frontal lobe. So that's in part a story for another time, but one interesting thing is that despite the fact that language and Python don't overlap, there's actually a high correlation between the left lateralization of language and the left lateralization of Python across people. And I think this is suggestive of maybe an interesting ontogenetic story where, although we cannot use our natural language parts of the brain to do Python, there's something about language that enables the development of these other representations in other systems of the brain. Okay, that's that. So what I want to argue from the data I've shown you so far is that the human brain has this amazing capacity to change, right? To change its representational content, I would argue qualitatively. And now I'm going to argue that this makes all the more impressive which things do not change in the face of blindness, right? So what I'm going to argue is that people who are blind have structured visual concepts in the absence of vision. So why would we think about this problem? This is, of course, a problem that I did not identify. It's a problem that philosophers have thought about for a long time, which is what is the role of sensory experience in structuring our concepts and our understanding? And in fact, philosophers have particularly pointed to blindness as a way of understanding this problem. So this is a quote from John Locke talking about rainbows, and he says, "But yet that definition, how exact and perfect soever, would never make a blind man understand it, because several of the simple ideas that make that complex one, being such as he never received by sensation and experience, no words are able to excite them in his mind." So what Locke is saying there is, you can talk to a blind person all you want, but they're never going to get what a rainbow is. They're never really going to understand what yellow is. And so this idea that sensory experience is somehow primary or fundamental and language cannot deliver in-depth understanding is an interesting one. And it's one that I'm going to argue against. First, I want to show you this kind of insane thing, which is that John Locke's ideas did not die with Locke. This is a crazy thing that has gone around the internet, started by teenagers, which is this idea that Helen Keller didn't really exist. So despite the many videos and books written about her and her life, this woman who, lost her sight and hearing and went on to go to Harvard and have this like really impressive life-meaning career, apparently, according to some people, she didn't exist. And so I want to partly pick up on this incredulous intuition, which is like, how is this possible? What do blind people really know? How is it possible that a person like Helen Keller could exist? And in doing so, I'm going to follow the venerable tradition of Barbara Landau and Lila Gleitman, who started the work of empirically documenting like what it is that blind people and blind children actually know about vision. So the first project I want to tell you about is a project I did with Rebecca Sachs and Jory Custer-Hale and Julia on visual verbs. So in this experiment, we asked blind and sighted participants to do the good old pair similarity judgment task, where you see a pair of words like glimpse and look, and you have to decide on a scale of 1 to 7 how similar in meaning they are. And so we did this in 2 subgroups of words. So verbs of perception and verbs of emission, and then some control categories. So there were visual words like glimpse, look, watch, gawk. They were paired with each other and with touch verbs and amodal perception verbs. And on the other hand, there were also emission verbs like blaze, blink, flash, flicker, and auditory emission verbs like beep, boom, chime, creak. And then as a control category, we had also motion verbs. People who are blind did this using a screen reader in their house, which is what blind people use to use computers a lot. So people would log in. There were thousands, I think something like 3,000 word pairs that people rated. They would log in, they would rate the pairs for however long they wanted. They would log out, and then they would come back, and they did this in about 2 weeks. So you can use these kinds of data to create semantic similarity matrices, which I'm showing to you on the right. Each square represents how similar 2 pairs were rated on average across participants. And there were, 22 sighted people and 25 blind people in the study. And then we did various things with these data, and I'm only going to highlight a few. So here I'm showing you data from the perception verbs, and you can see at the bottom the correlation between two groups of sighted people, right? So we have one sighted reference group and two groups of sighted people, and a group of blind people and a group of sighted people in terms of the similarity of meaning just for the visual perception verbs. And what you can see is that they're highly correlated, and two groups of sighted people are just as correlated as a group of sighted people and a group of blind people. So whatever this task is measuring, blind and sighted people seem to know the same thing. The MDS plot, what that's showing you is like, well, what are the kinds of dimensions that structure this space? So you can see that for sighted and blind people alike, visual verbs constitute a class that is distinct. So it's not that if I don't perceive things with my eyeballs, then for me, glancing is really more like touching. Nope, that's not true. Glancing still means perceived visually when presented without a context. It's also the case that for both populations, visual verbs are a little bit closer semantically to amodal perception verbs, which is consistent with some of the stuff that Asifa was talking about just now. The other thing to point out is that it's not the case that across blind people, this knowledge is any more variable than across sighted people. So this is leave one subject out correlation analyses, where I'm showing you basically coherence within the sighted group and coherence within the blind group for the visual verbs and coherence for the amodal verbs. There's no difference across verb types and no difference across groups. One interesting thing that we found, and maybe Asifa will solve this puzzle for me, I don't know what the solution is that blind individuals are a little more coherent for touch verbs than they are than sighted people on this measure, even though they're not different for either visual verbs or amodal verbs. We found a similar pattern for the light emission verbs. So again, blind and sighted people agree with each other very strongly. There are no differences across domains, no variability differences. What are the kinds of things that blind and sighted people know about these verbs? Well, the two dimensions that pop out for both groups very strongly, one is intensity. These are dimensions that linguists, by the way, identified 50 years ago. So great to rediscover it with semantic similarity judgments. So one is intensity. So verbs like flicker are intense, whereas in verbs like blaze are intense, whereas in verbs like glisten are low intensity, and verbs like flicker are periodic, whereas in verbs like glaze are not periodic, they're continuous. Blind and sighted people naturally deliver these dimensions. But again, what we see is that blind individuals are a bit better for the sound verbs. They're a little more consistent. So it's not that they know anything different about these verbs from the sighted people, but they're just a little bit more consistent for two types of sound verbs that we measured. Okay, so that's for verbs. Now I'm going to show you a little bit of brain data to suggest that it's not just that the behavior of the blind participants is similar to sighted people, but actually the underlying neural representations are similar, giving us a little bit more confidence that the underlying cognitive representations are also more similar. So this is a study done by Julia Ellie in collaboration with Connor Lane. So Julia presented blind and sighted participants with a similar task, but this time in the scanner. So participants saw 4 kinds of verbs, one of which was a light emission verb, and 4 kinds of nouns. So the first thing that I'm showing you here is that blind and sighted people activate similar neural systems when they understand concrete verbs and concrete nouns. So this is just looking for brain regions responsive more to verbs than nouns. And replicating stuff we found before, you get specific brain regions involved in verbs and nouns, and they're the same across the population. So the middle temporal gyrus, for example, responds more to verbs than nouns. And for example, the intraparietal area, which you can see in blue, responds more to nouns and verbs. So that's kind of interesting. What Julia showed was that you can decode among the different verbs and among the different nouns that based on patterns of activity within these brain regions in both blind and sighted individuals. So again, they're not just activating for these classes, but they are sensitive to the semantic differences among verbs and among nouns. And the verb areas are more sensitive to differences among verbs, and the noun areas are more sensitive to differences among nouns. And that's true for blind and sighted people. One cool thing that I want to show you in relation to what I said before is that blind and sighted people, so in that dark red color, I'm showing you the light emission verbs. So blind and sighted people activate to the same degree this verb region for light emission verbs. So it looks like blind and sighted people, I would argue, are using the same neural resources to understand these verbs, to do these semantic similarity judgment tasks. Okay, so I'm going to say something that I think will sound just like totally obvious and for many people, but somehow has turned into a controversy in the literature in the recent past, that word meanings are not reflections of our first person experiences, rather they're vehicles for sharing meaning. So it's not the case that for a blind person, sparkling means something different. It means exactly the same thing as it does for a sighted English speaker. Okay, but that's just words, right? And there's a lot more to language than words. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about what we do with words and how we learn from words. And particularly, I'm going to talk about inferences based on language. So the first study I want to tell you about is a study by Asifa Majid, who this is also present at the conference. If you want to hear more about this from a more knowledgeable source, you should go check out Lisa's asynchronous presentation. So I want to tell you about reasoning about visibility. So check out this woman, she's walking by this man. I think we naturally have some thoughts about what she might know based on having seen this individual, right? So what does she know? Does she know he's wearing a hat? Does she know whether he's a man or a woman? Does she know whether he's happy or sad? But we can do that also based on language. I need to X out because I can't read it to you. So I'm going to ask you to do this with me. So why don't you listen to the story? Sarah is a sighted adult. She was walking to the grocery store and walked past a brick row home that was right up against the sidewalk. A person was sitting on the front stoop of the row home. Sarah glanced at this person as she walked by them and then kept going. So based on what she saw, how likely is it that Sarah knows whether the person was smiling or frowning? I want you to just kind of play that to yourself in your head. How likely is it on a scale of 1 to 5 that she knows whether the person was wearing a hat? How likely is it that she knows whether the person has light blue or dark brown eyes, right? So what I'm saying here is that we can readily make these quantitative judgments about how likely someone is to know something based on a visual experience. So what Lisa did is she presented people with 14 questions based on these kinds of scenarios, and she manipulated various properties of the linguistic stimulus that I'll tell you about in a second. But essentially, she's asking, can people predict how likely someone is to see something? And she did this, of course, with blind and sighted individuals, and she also did it for both visual scenarios and hearing scenarios, okay? I want to draw your attention for a second to a point here, which is that the questions are partly overlapping for hearing and seeing stories. So in a hearing story, Sandra is a sighted woman who was riding the bus on her way home from the gym. There were only a handful of other people on the bus. No one was talking at the time. A person sitting one row behind Sarah said hello, okay? Based on what she heard, how likely is Sarah to know whether the person is 30 or 60 years old, a man or a woman, crying recently, British versus American accent, okay? Of course, there's some similarities between the kinds of things that people can learn from hearing versus seeing, but they're not identical. And even when they are the same, it's not guaranteed that what you learn with equal ease, right? So for example, you're not going to know whether somebody speaks with a British versus American accent based on looking at them. But similarly, it might be harder or easier to tell how old somebody is based on their voice versus their vision. So I'm going to return to this issue of cross-modal reasoning. And what I'm going to argue is that it doesn't come for free. So here are the data. So what I'm showing you here again is the correlation between the likelihood ratings of sighted people on the x-axis and the likelihood ratings of blind people on the y-axis. And what you find based on the hearing trials is that we get pretty high agreement across people, which means that our task is working and people produce reliable judgments according to which items are the most perceptible. And what Lisa showed was that blind and sighted people also agree nearly to the same extent, although maybe a little bit less for seeing scenarios, right? So a blind person has rich knowledge of how likely somebody is to see whether someone is wearing a hat versus what color eyes they have versus how old they are, which I think is quite impressive and raises a puzzle about how this knowledge is acquired. The other thing that Lisa did in this study is systematically manipulate two variables that we thought would affect people's judgments. One, the duration of the experience, whether somebody glanced or stared. And the other one was the distance from which they were looking. So in some scenarios, the person walks right past somebody. In another scenario, the person is on the other side of the street, right? So what Lisa predicted is that both blind and sighted people would show higher likelihood judgments for closer experiences and for experiences that were longer. So for staring versus glancing. So here are those data. And the way this is shown is the more likely is at the top and less likely is at the bottom. And what we're doing here is we're subtracting from, we're doing far minus close, right? So basically if the data are positive, then people are saying that things are closer to you, you're more likely to see. And it also, if they are positive, they're telling you that if you see something for a longer time, then you're more likely to see it, okay? So first I'm showing you the sighted data. So sighted people judge things that you see from a closer distance. You should be more likely to know them. And they showed the same effect for time. So if you stare at something, you're going to be more likely to know it than if you glance at it. And we found that blind people show the same pattern in the sense that they judge intuitively that when something is closer or when something lasts for a longer time, you're more likely to perceive it visually. But interestingly, you can see that blind and sighted people are weighting distance and time differently a little bit. And in the control trials, actually, for the hearing scenarios, blind and sighted people look the same. So across the board, blind and sighted people know and judge naturally that distance affects and time affects perception, but actually how they weight distance and time differs. And what I would argue is that that suggests that that weighting, exactly how much and how distance affects perception, is something that we gauge with visual experience. Okay, so what I would conclude up based on these data is that blind and sighted people build quantitative mental models of visual perception, and these visual mental models are acquired via inference from language and analogy from other modalities. Okay, so now I'm going to give you another example of inferring appearance, now moving on from verbs. This time, I'm going to tell you about inferring visual appearance from language, and this is work by Judy Kim and Julia Ellie. So Judy and Julia looked at what blind individuals know about the appearance of common animals. And what's cool about animals is, well, what's interesting about animals is that they're far in general, right? We don't generally palpate polar bears for a variety of reasons. So it's interesting to ask, what do blind individuals know about the appearance of wild animals? As a clue to how we learn appearance from language. This was a pretty extensive study with various kinds of tasks, and I'm only going to tell you about one of them. So in this task, Judy and Julia gave blind and sighted participants cards with the names of the animals, and they asked them to group the animals according to different dimensions. So in one sitting, the blind individual would be asked to group the animals according to their shapes. In another sitting, they would be asked to group the animals according to their texture. And yet in another case, they would be asked to do it according to color. The blind participants are getting the cards in Braille, sighted people in print, and it's untimed. Blind individuals and sighted people can examine their work and make changes, okay? And then what Judy and Julia measured is how likely animals are to be put in the same pile, right, across individuals, right, as a measurement of the degree to which they're judged similar by each of these populations. And so at the top, I'm showing you the similarity matrices across participants within each group for sighted people and blind people. And At the bottom, what I'm showing you is that agreement ratings based on data from individual participants and how similar they were to their own group and the other groups. So in the red bar, I'm showing you similarity among sighted people, and the purple bar is similarity of blind people to sighted people. So what you can see both by looking at the matrices and also by looking at the bar graphs is that for shape, blind and sighted people show high agreement. Okay, there's no difference. When you start to look at the texture and color cases, some disagreements start to emerge, and the disagreements are particularly pronounced for the case of color. So that's interesting. So one question that arises, why color, right? So one answer is Locke's answer, which is that color is the only dimension inaccessible via other senses. And I'll return to this explanation. The explanation that I naturally gravitated towards that turned out to be spectacularly wrong is verbalizability, right? So I had this idea, look, think about elephants and tigers, like they don't have focal colors. Maybe it's really difficult to name the colors, and that's why blind individuals don't converge on the same colors as sighted people. So Judy went to Asifa's papers and found a measurement of verbalizability or concordance, in this case, the Simon's Diversity Index, and she measured to what degree blind and sighted people, I'm just showing you data from sighted people, were able to name the colors of these animals or the shapes of these animals or their skin textures with agreement and concisely. So it's a measurement of both of these variables together. To what degree do people provide concise labels that agree with each other? This is the Simon's Diversity Index. And it turns out that I was spectacularly wrong. And color is incredibly nameable, which I probably could have learned from just reading Asifa's papers in greater detail. So it is not the case that the reason blind individuals don't share the same color categories of animals as sighted people do is because they're harder to name. And of course, that makes sense in retrospect, because try describing the shape of an elephant. By contrast, if you name it, the color, you just say gray, right? But what Judy showed was that what explains which features blind and sighted people share is how inferable they are from other abstract features of the animals. In particular, what Judy showed is that color is the only dimension that can't be inferred from taxonomy. So there's no correlation between the color similarity of animals, right? So swans are white and so are polar bears, but they don't share much else. By contrast, the shapes of animals are related to their evolutionary distance. And you can see some of this evidence that blind individuals are using habitat and taxonomy to make inferences about appearance from some of the disagreements among these populations. So interestingly, 50% of the blind participants said that hippopotamuses had fur. By contrast, 95% of sighted people said that they had skin, and hippopotamuses are large mammals. So, it would be reasonable that they might have fur. Interestingly, for sharks, sighted people said that they had skin. By contrast, 55% of blind people said they had scales. And in fact, sharks have tiny scales that are not visible to the naked eye, right? Unless you get really, really close, which we don't tend to do. Okay. So to give you a flavor for what I mean here, I want you to read this this inference, right? So if I tell you the zorba lives in the forest of Peru and hunts the guanaco, its teeth are sharp and its jaws are powerful. So now I'd like you to get an intuition. Do you have a sense for what the shape of the zorba is? By contrast, do you have a sense of what the color of the zorba is? So that's the intuition. The intuition is that blind individuals are able to infer the shape of animals based on this kind of linguistic evidence, but not the colors. Okay, so the last thing that I want to tell you about is this experiment by Judy. I'm so sorry I keep getting out of this, but I can't see my parts of my slides. This last study by Judy, which I'm absolutely in love with because Judy is totally brilliant. And this study, I think, provides the strongest evidence that blind individuals have intuitive theories of color. So In the previous study, I told you blind individuals share less color information with sighted people than shape. And I said, well, the reason is that color is less inferable, but of course it's perfectly possible that the reason is that color is special because it's uniquely accessible via vision. So in this study, Judy digs more deeply into what blind individuals know about color. And she looked at two kinds of color knowledge, associative color facts, polar bears are white, and causal color knowledge for natural kinds like polar bears, artifacts like cars, and artifacts with functional colors like paper. So she did this task, and I'd like you to do it with me using the chat. Would you please, well, you could skip the first question. What is the common color of a leaf? I want you to think of that answer to that question. And now I want you to answer in the chat on a scale of 1 to 7, with 7 being very likely. If you picked 2 leaves at random, how likely are they to have the same color? Please respond to that question. And now I want you to do the same judgment for a car. What is a common, oh, sorry. Let's do the usage trial first. What is a common thing that you can do with a leaf? If you pick 2 people at random and ask them each to do something with a leaf, how likely are they to do the same thing? On a scale of 1 to 7, please answer in the chat by entering a number. And now I want you to do the same thing for a car. So what is a common color of a car? I don't know, I think red, but let's see what you guys think. If you pick 2 cars at random, how likely are they to have the same color on a scale of 1 to 7? Please answer in the chat. I can see the answers rolling in, thank you. And if you, what about the same question for usage? What is a common thing you can do with a car? If you pick 2 people at random and ask them each to do something with the car, how likely are they to do the same thing? Please respond in the chat. So as you're doing that, I will show you the whoops. Yeah, so I'm going to show you the data from sighted people just to show you this intuition, which is that just like you, hopefully in the chat, people have the intuition that artifacts have larger likelihood to have common usages. By contrast, natural kinds like leaves are more likely to have consistent colors. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the blind and sighted data. So first, I'm giving you responses to what is a common color of a lemon. And consistent with what we found with the animal study, blind people show lower agreement for colors of common objects than sighted people. So in this graph, yellow means lower agreement, lighter colors mean lower agreement, darker colors mean high agreement. And what you can see is that, this is clear across all the categories, but for natural kinds, sighted people produce very consistent responses. By contrast, there's a lot of variability among blind people. And across all 3 categories, the variability across blind people is larger. Blind people don't converge on the same colors for these items, consistent with the idea that vision plays an important role in figuring out that, or agreeing on the fact that lemons are yellow. So these are just the same data averaged, and you can see that the agreement for color is lower for the blind participants than it is for the sighted people across the board, across the categories. So now I'm going to turn to the consistency judgments. So remember now that blind and sighted people alike agree that color is highly, not quite as, blind and sighted people alike agree that usage is more consistent for artifacts like cars, shown in blue, than it is for natural kinds like leaves, shown in green. And the reverse is true for color in sighted people. And the question is, what about for people who are blind? And the answer is that blind and sighted people show the identical pattern for these data. So first, if you just look at the dark blue and the green bars, that's just the natural kinds and artifacts like cars that have inconsistent colors. You can have a car of any color. What Judy did, which was so clever, is to include another category shown in light blue, which is artifacts with functional color like paper. And so for this category, the intuition flips. So people think that paper, because it has a causal color, which allows it's white so that you can see the markings, has a consistent color. And this is the same across blind and sighted people. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time and go back to it later. So one important thing that Judy showed is that this kind of intuition extends to objects that nobody has any experience with, namely novel objects. So for this, it couldn't be that you're using the statistics of language somehow to learn these intuitions. So imagine that you're an explorer on an island, and on your travels, you discover this culture and this ecology on a new island. And in this, on this island, you notice a miner excavating a green gem that is spiky and the size of a hand. It appears to be vibrating in place. The miners tell you that the gem is called an enli and that enlis are used as an energy source by the Zorka people. How likely is that the next time you see an enli, it's going to be green? And then we can do the same thing for artifacts. So while you're on this island, you notice that there's a gadget that is floating around the house, spraying an odorless chemical. The gadget is triangular yellow and the size of a thumb. A woman that you're talking to says that this gadget is called a canpa, and that this campa is rather old. How likely is that the next time you see a campa, it's going to be yellow again? And then Judy also came up with artifacts that have functional colors. So for example, like coins, and we can talk about more examples of artifacts with novel artifacts with functional colors that Judy came up with, like containers for disposing toxic waste is another example. And so what Judy showed was that for these novel objects for which people have no relevant specific linguistic, statistical, or perceptual experience, blind and sighted people show the same exact intuition about color consistency as they do for the real objects. So here I'm going to give you a qualitative feel for what's going on. So the other thing that Judy did was she collected explanations from blind and sighted participants about why objects have the colors that they do. So all sighted participants said that polar bears were white, and some blind participants said the same thing. And they explained this by saying to blend in with their Arctic environment. But some blind participants, a significant subset, said that polar bears were black, and they explained that this is to absorb heat. And I learned by doing the study that in fact, under their white fur, polar bears have black skin exactly for this reason, which you can't see. And there are similar kinds of explanations. So in a lot of cases, blind and sighted people don't agree on exactly what the canonical color of an object is. Like Mac laptops, this one blind participant thought that they would be red because they're colored according to their symbol, an apple, or that carrots are green because of chlorophyll. So blind individuals don't always converge on the same color as sighted people, but they produce coherent and sensible explanations for why the objects have the colors that they do. And in this analysis, what Judy did is she quantified the types of explanation that people produce for natural kinds, artifacts with non-functional colors, and artifacts with functional colors. And what she found is that the types of explanation produced are similar across populations. So for example, for artifacts with functional relevant colors, people often cite convention, so why are wedding dresses white, patriarchy, or why are uniforms a certain color to mark them. They also brought up visibility. So what these kind of data suggest is that blind individuals are forming abstract mental models, like sighted people, about how vision works. I think what these data also suggest is that language is better at conveying intuitive theories than random factoids, which is something that has been pointed out by anthropologists and linguists as well. And what I would argue based on these kinds of data is that learning from language is inferential. What does it mean to say that it's inferential? Blind and sighted people alike are constructing causal and generative mental models based on linguistic evidence. And what I want to end with is this quote from Helen Keller. So contra Locke, Keller had this beautiful quote. She says, critics delight to tell us what we cannot do. They assume that blindness and deafness sever us completely from the things which the seeing and the hearing enjoy. And hence, they assert we have no moral right to talk about beauty, the skies, mountains, the song of birds, and colors. Some brave doubters have gone so far even as to deny my existence. In order, therefore, that I may know that I exist, I resort to Descartes' method. I think, therefore I am. Thus, I am metaphysically established, and I throw upon the doubters the burden of proving my non-existence. And so I throw this burden up again from Helen. So to conclude, people who are blind develop structured causal theories of visual phenomena. People who are sighted also have them. For concept, sensory experience is dispensable, which I think is problematic for some models of what concepts actually are. Language provides fodder for inference and enables cognitive bootstrapping, borrowing this idea from Susan Carey, through knowledge sharing, right? So I think language is this beautiful vehicle for bootstrapping each other into a shared understanding. And I want to point you guys to the cool computational work by M.H. Tesler that tries to, having nothing to do with me, that tries to model how such inferences might work. And so language is a specialized, flexible, and powerful knowledge acquisition device. So the I would advocate based on these kinds of data, the rich story, not because I like rich stories, but because I think you can't do without it, which is that we have a brain that is innately specialized, but also powerful learning device. And the last thing I'm going to say is that I think the most important feature of language from the perspective of these data is that it enables the hive mind. So it's not that it's just a tool for thinking, it's a tool for us connecting with the rich knowledge that other people have so that we can share in that knowledge. And I want to end by thanking all of you for listening, thanking the lab, the blind participants, and the blind community who supported our work, and our collaborators and funders. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marina. We'll take a few questions just for Marina before we open them up to both of the talks. I see the first question from Ballant.
Thank you. This was a very exciting and amazing amount of work. So thanks for sharing it. I have one specific question about the individual differences of the rewiring of the visual cortex. So at the beginning, you showed these fascinating data, and I was wondering if this is something of a canonical procedure or process in the brain, and the visual cortex is recycled certain parts for language and other parts for logic, etc. Or is this something that is entirely up to the individual's personal wiring of his or her brain?
That's a great question. And the answer is that it's definitely consistent across people, right? Which I think supports the idea that it's building on an innate scaffold, right? So it's not that even though the, what I take those data really to support is the idea that there's a many to many structure to function relationship, right? So that the same structure can support qualitatively different cognitive content, not that there isn't innate structure to work with, right? And I think the individual difference question that you asked really speaks to that. If there weren't a consistency across people, there really would be no way we could really see it. It would look like a mess in many of the analyses that we do. So there's a very consistent pattern. So like the same part of the visual cortex that does language in this blind person, roughly speaking, does that in another blind person. So far, we haven't, there's a question quantitatively, like, is that consistency larger in other parts of the brain or is it not? But in general, the answer is yes, there is that consistency. And I think we already have some evidence that it has to do with the connectivity patterns present in the brain.
We'll take the next question from Andrew, and then we'll be in the general period. So sorry, there's a little bit of that. Then we'll be in the general period. If you have a question for either of our speakers, make yourself known, and then I'll prioritize voices that we haven't heard from before. So now to Andrew's question.
Hi, thank you so much. So I just want to come in and defend Locke and the philosophers a bit. So there's this old chestnut that philosophers have trotted out and said, like, well, yeah, of course you're right. I can understand all of the different similarity relationships between different colors and causal connections, a whole story about wavelengths, etc. But there's still something that if I don't have this direct sensory experience with color, I'm going to not be knowledgeable of this kind of subjective character of what it's like to experience a red strawberry. And so I suppose you might say, look, that is the real meaning of the word red. So if you don't have that subjective understanding, you don't understand really the meaning of the word red. You could say, oh no, actually the meaning of the word red is something else. And then this is, this subjective experience. Well, that's just something extra that you can know about red things, after you already have the meaning. Or I guess you could deny the premise here and just say, oh no, there isn't this extra subjective character to your experience, that these relational properties that you're talking about, it just exhaust everything people can know about the color red. So I just wanted to hear your take on how you're thinking about that, and in particular, what you mean by the meaning of words when you're saying that the meaning of the word red is the same for blind and sighted.
That's a great question. And I should be clear that I don't deny that people who have different sensory experiences can have different episodic memories or different qualia memories. I have never thought of a way to study qualia empirically. And so if anybody thinks of a way, I will do it, but I haven't done so. But what I would argue is that, and nor do I really want to have like a definitional discussion, right? I think there's some arguments that qualia shouldn't be considered part of concepts or whatever, but I don't want to, I'm not going to offer anything with respect to that particular issue. What I would say is that what we're doing is identifying a lot of rich knowledge that seems to support thinking, reasoning, communication, like all the things that we as psychologists study that doesn't seem to be require qualia at all, right? So that's one point. I guess the other point is that, so you've said something about wavelengths, and actually, of course, there's more philosophical writing on this topic besides Locke, like Mary, the color scientist, and all this kind of work. And I would, on the one hand, I want to say this isn't about qualia. On the other hand, I want to say this is not about wavelengths, right? So we're not studying like formal theories of color understanding that you learn in school that you wouldn't learn just naturally by talking to people. So I think a lot of that philosophical discussion misses this intermediate level of understanding that we acquire just by talking to people. And what this work is about is really uncovering what that knowledge is, right? So this isn't a, I don't know how color works personally. As far as like wavelength transmission, right? But I do have a colloquial understanding of color. And so that's the understanding that I think we're studying and is shared among these populations. Thanks for that question.
Our next question's from Gary.
Thank you for the beautiful talk, Marina. And I think one reason why this work is so important, in addition to many of the ones you mentioned, is something you did mention in your conclusion, that it challenges a lot of theories that emphasize perceptual experiences. In particular, for example, word learning studies, that developmental studies that focus on visual features in particular, at the exclusion, perhaps because they're much easier to study, at the exclusion of all of the relational and abstract knowledge we learn as young children about what a word means. So I've been reflecting on this, whether we differ or really agree on this issue of where this knowledge comes from. And in your work, and Judy, you've emphasized the role of inference. And I sort of, without denying the importance of inference, I found myself being biased on the importance of the content. So for example, to infer that flamingos have a certain shape because they're birds, you need to know they're birds. And how would you know they're birds in the first place? So a sighted person might have observed them and from their appearance concluded, well, they look like other birds, they must be birds. But even for many sighted people, I guess I've seen a flamingo once or twice in zoos, but I don't have direct experience of it. Even for me, it's mainly coming from language. And I assume for congenitally blind people, even more so. And so what use is inference without the content on which to do the inferential processing? And if the content, so much of it is coming from, as we've argued, the distributional properties of language. So not just, importantly, being told flamingos are birds, but even in the absence of being told that, that knowledge is in the structure of language, as we've been trying to show. So you know, I guess the question is, what use is inference without the content, and kind of how do you weigh those against one another? Yeah.
Thanks, Gary. I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I guess I would say I don't weigh those. In other words, of course, I mean, I think one of the exciting and interesting things is that language, like one thing you and I completely agree on is that language is an important communication medium. It's an important way of transmitting information efficiently, transmitting detailed, rich causal information, right? That's so I think, you know, I wouldn't want to say like, is it this one or that one? Of course, if you don't have the information, you want, you know, a medium for doing that, you're going to not be in good shape, right? That said, I think there are some ways of thinking about how you learn from language that are not the way that I think about it. So you've brought up this like distributional idea, and I just don't understand how you would get to like that Zorks have a consistent color based on distribution. Like I'm not really sure what distribution means, but I don't know how tracking the neighborhoods of what other words a word occurs with gets you to what you want. So the reason I'm saying inference is what I'm trying to highlight is this idea that the kind of knowledge that people are building is rich, causal, structured, complex, right? And so the kind of process that's going to deliver, and the evidence is often indirect, as you pointed out, like not saying flamingos are pink, right? So I don't know what, you know, maybe you would like a different word to use to say how this knowledge is extracted. But so the way I really think about it is that you have to infer modifications to your mental model of vision, of light, of color, based on the linguistic evidence. And really the language is a medium of communication between people rather than a thing in and of itself, right? Even sometimes communication between people 100 years ago and people now. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I wouldn't want to trade one or the other.
Okay. And maybe we can discuss more. I don't want to, dominate the channel.
Since we don't have any more questions, if you'll hang out with us for 30 more seconds, we're going to attempt another group photo. So if you want to be in the photo, turn on your video, prepare your smiles. After the photo, it'll be straight into the asynchronous session, and come back for the second session of the day with Paul Petrosky and Alexis Wellwood, which will head right into our gala social event on the Slack channel.